You're watching Notepad with me, Ibrahim Sani, broadcasting from the All Asia Broadcasting Centre here in Bukit Jalil, Kuala Lumpur. Recently, the Minister of International Trade and Industry, Datuk Sri Azmin Ali, said in a statement in the US that Malaysia will move towards a targeted fuel subsidy. This is because of rising fuel subsidy bill from 11 billion 2 years ago to 28 billion this year. And of course, we're trying to understand a little bit better whether or not this targeted fuel subsidy is going to work, how it's going to solve problems. In fact, can it be implemented outright? Joining us online is Professor Dr. Geoffrey Williams. He is the Provost for Research and Innovation at the Malaysia University of Science and Technology, or MUST. Geoffrey, let's get an idea of whether or not this is indeed a good proposal to start off with.
It's not. It isn't a good proposal. I mean, it sounds quite attractive because there is a very large subsidy bill at the moment. So the estimate from the Ministry of Finance is that it might be at least 28 billion, if not more than that. So it does sound like a good idea to try to reduce that bill. But the problem with the targeting process is that it raises more problems than it solves. The first issue is that we don't know how to target. We don't know who to target. The proposition, the general proposition, is that we should target people in lower income groups and remove the subsidies from people in higher income groups. But actually, what we really should be doing is targeting the people who need the subsidy and taking it away from people who don't need the subsidy. And that really doesn't have much to do with your income. In fact, you might have quite a lot of people in lower income groups who don't need a subsidy because they don't use petrol or they use much less of it. But then you might have quite a lot of people in a middle income group, for example, who need to use their car, need to use their bike to get to work in the morning, particularly if they're outside of Kuala Lumpur or some of the major cities where there's no real public transport. These guys don't earn a lot of money. They're in the middle or lower income groups, but they do use a lot of petrol because they don't have an alternative. So we need to try to think about who should target it. We don't necessarily have a good idea of how to do that, and looking just at income isn't necessarily the best way of dealing with it. The second big problem is we don't have a mechanism to introduce targeting. When we think about a universal subsidy, it's very easy. Everybody gets the same discount, and you go to the petrol station and the price of the pump has been cut for everyone. So it's very straightforward. When you're trying to target it, you want particular people to get the discount, you want other people not to get the discount. So we need to have a mechanism to work that out, and we don't have a mechanism. An old-fashioned mechanism would be to give people discount tickets or discount vouchers. A more modern approach, of course, would be to give people some sort of digital discounting card. But the fact is we just don't have it. We don't have it in place. There is one mechanism that could possibly work, and that would be tiered pricing, like we have with electricity, where you would charge a different price according to the amount of petrol that you were buying. But again, I'm not sure that the point of sales operations of most petrol stations have that mechanism in place or that technology in place at the moment.
Sorry, but we need to also talk about how to look at the 28 billion ringgit fuel subsidy bill. It's only going to go up. How then do you propose we solve for that?
Well, the issue with the 28 billion is this. This is a subsidy that is being paid by the government. If you take it away, then somebody else has to pay it. So if you take it away from transferring it to people in the form of a petrol subsidy, all that's going to happen is that people who are using petrol are going to have to find the money to pay for that subsidy. It's not a free lunch, this 28 billion. And if you take it away, it's not that the government will save the 28 billion and then be able to use it on other aspects of government expenditures freely. Somebody's going to have to pay that. So it's a welfare transfer. And there's the second thing about the 28 billion is that part of it is recovered because Malaysia raises revenue, government revenue in particular, through the sale of petrol. So although it looks like a very large number, and it is a very large number. Actually, part of that is already there because the government has a subsidy budget. Part of the increase will be covered by the increase in petrol revenue, and that means that Malaysia isn't like other countries, such as Thailand, for example, where they don't necessarily have the hydrocarbon income to cover the cost of the subsidy.
Do you feel that a universal basic income would work in this sense? So you put more money inside the hands of the people and up to them to spend however they want, with whether it's on fuel or food or any other necessities?
In the long term, we definitely want to move away from subsidies because subsidies are distorting. So if we look at the petrol subsidy in particular, artificially lowering the price of petrol encourages more and more people to use cars and to use motorbikes. And that's clearly not helpful if you also have a zero carbon target, for example, in the long term. So the subsidy is distorting, and in the long term, we want to remove it. But we have to remove it slowly as prices start to stabilize and prices start to normalize. Now, the other side of the cost of living problem isn't just prices are rising. The other side of the cost of living problem is, of course, what you just mentioned, which is income. So if we can find a way of helping people to raise their income and to raise the earning potential, that will help them to stabilize their spending power, even if prices are rising. The universal basic income is one way of doing that. There were a number of different models of introducing a universal basic income. One that I'm quite keen on is called a negative income tax or a tax credit system. And what happens there is you will set a threshold for the income. If your income falls below that threshold, instead of paying tax to LHDN, you will receive a tax credit. And if your income goes above the threshold, then you will pay taxes in the normal way. This is a very simple, a very straightforward, relatively efficient system of helping people when their income falls below a particular threshold.
Okay, we'll go for a short break. When we come back, we'll discuss a bit more with Professor Geoffrey Williams of MUST. Welcome back. I have with me on the line Professor Dr. Geoffrey Williams. He is the Provost for Research and Innovation at the Malaysia University of Science and Tech, or MUST. Geoffrey, I also want to ask you more about that notion of moving away from subsidy. It's, of course, these are the lofty ideals that economists like yourselves always talk about, but there's always that whole problem of trying to achieve it, building some sort of an idea where we can implement it at the policy level, where MPs and later on ministries can actually put in place and execute. What would be some of the bigger things that you want to talk about when it comes to removal of subsidies, the timeline of it, the policy of it, what targeted subsidies to remove first? Do you think that all this can work in the near term, and perhaps how do we move away from subsidies altogether for the longer term?
I think that the situation that we're in now, where we're seeing this very, very big petrol subsidy bill, this 28 billion, has become a little bit iconic. And it has actually started the discussion amongst politicians about the nature of subsidies, the extent of subsidies, and whether we should be starting to move away from subsidies. So I agree with you. Politicians quite like subsidies for very many reasons. But when the cost gets very high, they tend to want to look at other alternatives. My view is the subsidies should be eased out, but they should be eased out much more slowly over a period of time when markets start to normalize. And the normalization of markets requires the removal of a lot of the restrictions, a lot of the permits, the APs, for example. We've already started the discussion about removing those. I think that all of the APs across all of the categories where they are applied should be removed. In fact, the extent of government regulation, government licensing in any form of product shouldn't really go far beyond health and safety licensing and health and safety checks. We've started that sort of discussion, and I hope that we will continue to have a further discussion on that. We've also started a discussion on competition. The Prime Minister has made clear that there is an ongoing inquiry into whether whether the food industry as a whole, whether the supply chains, whether the production of food and distribution of food, whether that is competitive or not. Malaysia does have an anti-competitive law, an anti-competition law, an anti-monopoly law. They do have Malaysia does have a competition commission, and the competition commission is investigating that. So that's all part of improving overall competition, improving the liberalization of markets, but it's a long-term thing. And it's not a quick fix. The problem we have with subsidies now is that we have them in place, and if we remove them too quickly, we have a huge problem. Imagine petrol prices going, RON 95 going from 2 ringgit 5 cent and perhaps doubling because of the removal of a subsidy overnight, for example. That would have massive implications, not just for paying for the petrol at the pump, but also the costs, not just in terms of petrol prices, but the costs of every other product in the consumer price index. And if you remove the subsidies too quickly, you're going to get a general inflation. Malaysia has inflation about 2.2% at the moment. In the UK, it's 9%. In America, it's 8.5%. And if you remove the subsidies on petrol too quickly, you would have a massive increase in inflation. And the only way to solve the increase in inflation would be to raise interest rates. And that would cause a pretty devastating impact on the recovery, which is starting. We do have the beginnings of economic recovery, but it's still very weak. So we need to be certainly looking at the removal of subsidies over the long term because they're distortionary and they're expensive. But we can't do it overnight, and this idea of targeting is much easier said than done. And it's very good for the politicians, and it's very good for the electorate with an election coming up. But as we've just mentioned, there really aren't very many ways in which we can solve that targeting problem.
Jeff, there's also that whole notion of contradiction inside how we do things. We want to remove AP for food, but then, you know, the rice with Bernas is still there. We have anti-monopoly laws or anti-competitive laws, antitrust laws to improve competitiveness, but then Bernas is a monopoly in its own right. This is just an example. I'm not trying to egg on Bernas to, you know, come out and do something, but this is the thing that we do all the time. We have one way of doing it, and then, of course, the legacy issues remain and we're not solving the entirety of the problem. So what's the point of, say, for instance, removing the AP of food when monopolies do still exist?
Well, I agree. I wholly agree. And the issue of giving people licenses, giving people concessions and protecting them issuing these licenses and permits on the basis of non-commercial characteristics, let's put it like that, that has been something which has caused the rigidities in the markets in the past. We've always had problems as a consequence of that issuance, the license issue and the lack of competition. But now we're seeing this much more acutely because we have a crisis in front of us. So my view is very much that all of the APs and all of the concessions should be reviewed as part of an ongoing market liberalization process. In the end, licenses should only be issued for commercial reasons to the companies that are best able to offer the best business solution. That's number one. And secondly, there should be as few licenses as possible. And as I mentioned before, really just limiting to protecting health and safety in products and food, for example. If we had that, we can open up markets to competition. If we had more competition, we would have first a much more healthy supply of products. If prices rose, that would encourage companies to supply more because they could see that there was a profit opportunity, and the whole level of competition would, generally speaking, keep the overall price level lower. But I agree, there is a lot of legacy, very, very many legacy issues there. But the reform process going forward has to, in my view, focus on liberalization and market reform.
One more short break before we conclude our conversation with Professor Geoffrey Williams. Thanks for staying on with us. On the line is Professor Dr. Geoffrey Williams, the economist at Malaysia University of Science and Technology. Geoffrey, we fall back to the earlier part of the topic, which is on subsidizing fuel for consumers. The issue, the way I look at it is, on one hand, everybody agrees that subsidies is not a good thing, but then wage is a big problem for Malaysia. We're talking about structurally, Malaysia is trapped in a middle income situation with no end in sight. I remember interviewing the World Bank, the previous World Bank of Malaysia head, and he was arguing that everything is in a state of limbo where we cannot push forward to become a high income nation, and this is going to be a big risk for Malaysia for the next decade or so. At the same time, we have to talk about the problems of the day. You were mentioning that there was no mechanism in place, and that everything that needs to be done is, it's nice to say, particularly by a politician, but when we want to roll it out on the ground, details are scant. So if I can refer to you an article by Paul Tan, he was talking about in 2014, there was a plan where those earning below 5,000 a month would receive full subsidy. Those earning between 5,000 to 10,000 would only get partial subsidy. Anybody who earns 5 figures do not get any subsidy. This plan never went through. And of course, then there was another way of doing it, which is to be able to sell it at market price at the pumps and pay out subsidies the same way cash aid, such as Bantuan Keluarga Malaysia is done, or Bantuan Prihatin Rakyat, or Bantuan Khas COVID-19 have been paid out in the past. And somehow or other, this is perhaps an idea that is put on the table, but we don't know yet whether or not ideas like this is going to be done. Do you believe that if there is, assuming, hypothetically, if there is a mechanism that can be done, it should be done, or are you still going to be skeptical in terms of how things are going to be rolled out at the end of the day on the ground by these ministries?
I think that the mechanisms that people often discuss, which are discounting or cash transfers or targeting based on income for the reasons I've mentioned before, they don't really work. There is one mechanism, which is tiered pricing, like the type of thing that we have in electricity, which would be to say for small quantities, let's say 10 liters, you would pay the subsidized price of 2 ringgit 5 sen. If you bought more than that, you would pay a higher tariff. If you bought above that, you would pay another additional high tariff approaching the market rate. And that would mean people with bigger cars and people who use more petrol would get some help. But if they were simply filling up a big SUV because they're very wealthy, then they would have to pay as the more that they bought. And of course, those in the lower income groups would tend to buy smaller quantities. And so they would, as a whole, benefit from the total subsidy. That type of scheme could be put in place, but, well, that type of scheme can be put in place, and we know how it works because we know how it works for electricity tariffs. But for the electricity companies, we've had this in place for decades. And for petrol companies, we haven't got this in place, and we would have to introduce an entirely new scheme. The problem with other forms of subsidy, targeted subsidy, where you would have, let's say, for just for ease of to understand the concept easily, let's say you had some sort of voucher, which is either a physical voucher or an electronic voucher. The fact is, if you didn't use petrol, you would just sell the voucher. And so you would have, eventually what you would have is a sort of shadow market in the sale of the discount. The sale of the discount through selling people your voucher or selling people the use of your card, your discount card, in order to go to buy the petrol, or just going on their behalf and buying it for them. So you would get a huge problem with this shadow market in the sale of the discount, and you would have a huge problem in terms of monitoring and enforcement of that, and it wouldn't make it would just make the whole process very, very, very difficult and very, very complicated. But there is, of course, the other issue, which is that if you introduce these targeting schemes and it brings down the total, you introduce these targeting schemes and it causes the overall price to go up, then that overall price increase will pass through to other prices, and then you have an inflationary problem.
Do you think that at least for fuel and the subsidy issue regarding fuel, the advent of electric vehicles is going to be driving the momentum even further, the want or the demand for it?
Well, I mean, you see, this is one of the issues amongst many about the distortionary effects of the subsidies. The fact that we subsidize petrol keeps conventional cars very cheap, cheap to run. If we remove the subsidies and the prices were to rise, price of petrol were to rise more naturally over time, you would see people finding electric vehicles as being a better option, a more attractive option in economic terms. But then, of course, there are issues about the licensing and the regulation of the sale of electric vehicles. In the past, when the government was trying to encourage electric vehicles, they didn't have any particular licensing restrictions, and they had tax benefits to buying the vehicles, and the numbers of people who wanted to buy electric vehicles went through the roof. They were very, very popular. But then when they started to take away those tax benefits and make electric vehicles more similar to conventional cars in terms of price, then people prefer the conventional car because actually the petrol costs, the running costs are much lower because they're subsidized. So that's one of the reasons why in the long term we want to deal with the subsidy issue.
Okay, it's a chicken and egg argument the way I look at it right now. EV is not going to take up in demand because fuel subsidies are low. Fuel subsidies are, fuel subsidies are there, so people are going to continue using fuel. Do you feel that a great restart is in the air, that we need to have a new rethink on how we do things, not just about subsidies, but adoption of cleaner technology and move, all the other stuff that needs to be done, but might be painful, at least for the first few steps that needs to be taken? Do you think that great...
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes, I do, because I think, after the COVID period, the COVID lockdowns, we were all ready for the economy to reopen, and we were all ready to have a new conversation about the future of work, the future of business, work from home, e-commerce, all sorts of topics were on the table: social protection, how we're going to deal with pensions, how we're going to fund healthcare. And so there was a big push for all of that. And I hope that we will actually start to see that that's really quite important, because we had the COVID lockdown, then we thought that was going away and we were going to be able to start to recover. And then immediately afterwards, now we have these food shortages and these oil price hikes, for example. So I think it just reinforces the need for a proper national conversation and holistic discussion, not just tinkering on particular policies in particular ways, which are necessary in the short term because we face particular short-term issues. But in the long term, we need to completely restructure and reevaluate how the Malaysian economy will work in the future, particularly if, as you mentioned a moment ago, we want to get out of this middle income trap and move into a high income, high quality, high growth economy.
All right. Let's end there, I suppose. That was Professor Dr. Geoffrey Williams, the Provost for Research and Innovation, as well as an economist at the Malaysian University of Science and Technology. If you've missed any part of this interview, just head on to astro.com, look for Notepad over there. You can also look for these kind of interviews on our sister show called Niaga AWANI. It airs daily from Mondays to Fridays at 9 a.m. live. Until then, thanks very much for watching and goodbye.